Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to continue with the series on Indian sociological tradition and talk about feminist anthropologist Irawati Karve. In the series on Indian sociological tradition, we talked about Srinivas, we talked about G.S. Ghurye, we talked about Radhakumar Mukherjee, but we have left out Irawati Karve. So today we are going to see the contribution of Irawati Karve to sociology. Now, Irawati Karve was the first women anthropologist in India because at the time that she was writing, anthropology and social science or sociology was kind of unknown and it was emerging in the Western country. And in India, much of the theorization of Indian society were done by Western thinkers and by large of them were by men. So let us look into a woman growing up, learning and becoming an anthropologist. So we go through the traverses through her life, her biography, education and the work that she has done in order to give her the title of a feminist anthropologist. So she was also the founder of anthropology department at Pune University. So if we look into her career as an anthropologist, it stretches from early period of institutionalization in colonial India. Institutionalization because she played a key role in establishing the Department of Anthropology and also kind of starting off the field work which was absent in India. And from colonial period institutionalization, it stretches to the post-independent period. So it covers a huge range or a period and she works on a number of issues, caste, kinship, the problems, social problems, dams and how the development issue was affecting human development, social change, and being an anthropologist, she was trying to bring in the element of understanding society from a more scientific perspective. So she used her anthropological understanding of human origin as to understand the diversity in India. So there are a lot of literature which is also talks about unity in diversity, that India as a society is heterogeneous, a number of race, religion and regional differences exist. So she was trying to understand it from applying an anthropological understanding. So she retained this interest in classical anthropology with the question of human right as applied in the social context. So these were some of the key debates at the time that she was growing up and learning and writing, which was affecting much of the way in which we could construct a sociology of India by Indians themselves. So till she comes into picture, much of the discourse on India were from an Orientalist perspective. People were trying to, from the West, objectify India and give a very Western theory to understanding Indian society. If we look into her education at a time that her education was kind of not easily available, she was educated and at Fergusson College and graduated in 1926. She received the Dakshina Fellowship. She was under the head of the Department of Sociology in Bombay University. After her graduation, as much of in those days would happen with women where marriage is considered as mandatory, she was married. She was married to D.D. Karve, whose father was a well-known social reformer. But keep in mind that it was a time where gender or the concern for women empowerment was not kind of easily acceptable. So he was a reformer, social reformer, kind of giving voice for education of girls and women to kind of get educated. But when it came to his own daughter-in-law wanting to go to Germany, going to a foreign country to achieve education, Karve's father-in-law kind of refused it, and kind of was a time that even the issue of women education was kind of differently taken by the reformers. There was a conservative thinkers who would say that women should continue to be in the domestic sphere and education was not necessity because she would ultimately have to get married and look after her family. The other school of social reformers wanted women to be educated, but here also the concern was that women would be educated not for her own agency, not to kind of empower her, but because she would become a good mother who could educate her children or could become a good educated wife. So between these conflicting contexts in which she was growing up, she got support from her husband, who allowed her to go to Germany for higher studies. Now, when we look into the major work, we know it covers a huge range of issue, but we can systematically put it under certain areas. So, we see the most kind of classical work for which Irawati Karve is known for is her work on kinship and caste. And to understand kinship and caste, she uses the survey method. Survey method in the sense of census data to understand how urbanization as a process of social change was bringing change in the pattern of family, marriage relations. Then she also studies the economic aspect by looking into the weekly market. Now, the weekly market which we see around gives us an important way to understand the economic dimension, where many of the weekly market, which we even see in contemporary India, there is a large participation of women. So she's looking into weekly markets, is also looking into the dam displacement. So this is also a time when there were a lot of debates and discussion on development and where can we go, at what speed do we take development, which also kind of threatens the social and human dimension of human life. So her two major work was kinship organization in India, which is an exhaustive study of the kinship pattern in different parts of the country. So it's a kind of mapping the country into different zone and explaining the kinship pattern there. The second work of Irawati Karve is Hindu Society and Interpretation, which was published in 1968. The third book is Yuganta, The End of an Epoch. Here, Karve studied the character and society in Mahabharata. So, it was also kind of understanding her approach was Indological. Now, what is Indological approach? Indological approach is a method of studying the society by making reference to the existing literature. So, in India, we kind of have a lot of epics and lot of religious texts which tell us about the norms and values of Indian society. Mahabharata, Ramayana, Upanishads. So, most of the study of Indian society were basically Indological. But then Karve took a step ahead. She used her Sanskritic knowledge to study these texts, but also kind of made it more contemporary by doing field work and figuring out whether these Indological facts are empirical reality. So the subject of the book on book Yuganta was secular, scientific and anthropological. Being born in an upper caste family is the context. So it's very important to keep in mind whenever we look into the biography or to the contribution of any thinker, to understand the context in which the thinker is growing up, which also kind of frames the way the thinkers think about a problem. So if we look into the context of Irawati Karve, it brings into our mind three things. One, that she was born in a upper caste affluent family. Now, why is this becomes an important context is that being a child of an upper class caste educated family made it possible for her to receive education, and in those days kind of women education was limited to upper caste. The second was that at a very young life she was adopted by the wife of the principal of Ferguson College. Now, growing up in an intellectual atmosphere added to her cultural capital. The third context was the nationalist and reform movement. Now, she was growing up at a time when nationalist feeling and reform, social reform was on the peak, and especially in Maharashtra. So, the emphasis was of the social reform was to educate girls, and the education of a girl was seen as a step towards gender equality. It was also seen as a symbol of the progress of the nation. So, therefore, she was kind of fortunate enough to receive high education. Now, when we look into the intellectual influence, we see there are a number of individuals and the school of thought that influenced and inspired Karve, and specifically in the area of doing field work, where she does a number of extensive, exhaustive field work to understand society in India. And the most classical example of the field work is kinship organization in India. Now, if we look into the influences, there are three approaches or individual who influence them. The first is the Indological tradition, to which her MA supervisor, G.S. Ghurye. As we know, and we've done a lecture on G.S. Ghurye, he was one of the founding father of sociology, and his approach was Indological. Now, Karve, studying under G.S. Ghurye, is influenced by his approach. The second is the ethnological tradition. Ethnological tradition basically implies an in-depth understanding through survey, through a lot of fieldwork, empirical data of caste and tribes in India, and had broad affinity with diffusionism. The third is German physical anthropology tradition, which attempted to provide a genetic base for the existence of variety of group. So, as we have already said, that her objective was to understand diversity in India. Now, her training in physical anthropology kind of inspired her to kind of take this field into practice in India. The fourth influence is her own curiosity. So, as a researcher, as a scholar, she was not content as kind of just leaving it to the Indological approach or just reading text. She had a passion. She had a lot of curiosity to understand caste, to understand family, to understand tribe, and this took her on large scale of field work. Now, we look into this fourth tradition because it helps us to understand why she is giving us an understanding of kinship and caste. So, the first influence is the Indological tradition of G.S. Ghurye. G.S. Ghurye became her mentor when she received the fellowship to work under his tutelage. As part of the master course, she received this fellowship to do research, and G.S. Ghurye was her supervisor. Now, G.S. Ghurye inspired her to start on research on caste and kinship, along with method of empirical field work. If we look into the kinship organization in India, it is a kind of a work which was absent from an Indian anthropologist or sociologist. So, his impact, Ghurye's impact on Karve is kind of quite outstanding. Now, Ghurye was student of W.H. River at Cambridge, and he used the tradition of diffusionism for understanding variation. Diffusionist was a school which was kind of the opinion that the pattern, the norms and values diffuses in a society and it spreads, and that's how we can kind of understand the cultural specificity of society. Karve, influenced by Ghurye, also uses diffusionism in her book Hindu Society, and using the theory of diffusionism, she examines the vast range of diversity found in India. So, the diversity is not only the types of caste or the number of caste and jati that we have in India, it also in terms of no universal pattern of kinship or marriage and family. There is a lot of variation, there is a lot of diversity within Indian society. So, the Indological tradition was G.S. Ghurye and also Louis Dumont, who works on the idea of pollution and purity in the caste system. So, Dumont inspired Karve in a different way, where reading the Sanskritic text gave an insight to the unity in diversity. So the Indological tradition that Carve subscribed was very different from Dumont, in that there are no attempt to build or elicit an ideal underlying model of social relation. So the Louis Dumont just gives us model and gives us these are the way in which the caste functions, because his work was basically based on reading text and also kind of talking only to the upper caste. Now Carve takes it further. He kind of examines the characteristics of caste system outlined by Dumont at the empirical level. So Carve adopted kinship terminology classification. Now kinship terminology is very relevant to understand kinship, because terminology also tells us how two individuals are related or what are the roles and responsibility between the two. So in her study of kinships, she uses the classification terminology and also kind of formed one of a criticism, as she became vague while writing many kinship terms which weren't always clear. The second influence is ethnological tradition, recovered old-fashioned anthropology by combining four subfields: archaeology, cultural, linguistic and physical anthropology. Census and survey data collections were the prime focus of the tradition, which was also used by Carve while writing her books and her research paper. Through Carve, Carve internalized the understanding of cultural variation in the society as a result of migration of different ethnic group and historical approach. So she's not kind of using only one particular comparative methodology or historical approach. She's combining Indological approach with empirical field work, with historical approach to comparative approach, and giving us a holistic understanding of the society. The third influence is German anthropology. Now, German anthropology was dominated by physicalist tradition at the time that Carve went to do her higher studies, and it was more of the physical anthropology which was dominated, and it was studied as a branch of medicine. So it was more close to the science, physical science, than to anthropology. So one of the pioneer figure was Carve's German supervisor, Jürgen Fischer. The genetic approach of studying race was taken up by Carve while studying certain caste and tribal origin. These genealogical traditions were used by Carve to show how joint family changed over time. So she will be talking about that how these kind of shift and continuities are happening in caste and family. The fourth influence, which is her own passion and curiosity for field work, she carried out intensive surveys of different groups within particular region. Her thesis on the Chitpavan Brahman, an ethnic study, is an example of physical anthropology combined with Indological discussion. Carve concludes that it contains both semi-historical tradition and an explanation for the resentence of the sea, which was geologically known to be true. Another instance of her ability to undertake field work comes from Sankila's account of their joint expedition. So, there is a large extent of field work monographs that Irawati Karve has worked on. So, if we look into her anthropological work coming out of the large scale field work, we can divide it into four different heads. First is her work on physical anthropology and archaeology, where she uses the anthropometric method to study the blood group and the kind of measurement of nose, and also in terms of understanding the physical anthropology. The second is cultural anthropology, where she talks about kinship, the kinship variation, and the relation between caste and kinship. The third is socio-economic survey, which is weekly market, dam, and etc. The fourth is contemporary social comment, where she will be talking about women empowerment, language, and she also, when we kind of look into her understanding of women, she wrote at one place that it's not necessary to fight for equal rights, rather we should fight for more right. So that was also her area of interest. So when we look into these four categories, these are chronologically arranged. As she progresses, does research, there is a progression in the way in which she thinks. So if we were to kind of understand whether we can call Irawati Karve as a feminist or not. First thing is to understand that she is a feminist because she had a unique approach to her life at a time that not many women were writing, not many women were able to articulate their thought. And Nandini Sundar, in the article on the biography of Irawati Karve, writes that she did not use her husband's name. Generally, there is a kind of a cultural practice for women to change their name on marriage. Even in those days, she did not change and called her husband by his name. She did not wear the symbols of Hindu married women, which we kind of generally find it in our North Indian patrilineal, patriarchal society, where it is kind of a cultural practice to wear sindoor or mangal sutra. She was not doing any of these. And she was the first woman to ride a two-wheeler in 1952. So, but the fact is that we cannot kind of just label her as a feminist because she was not at any point of time complaining about her gender. So she was no different from a men anthropologist. So she was kind of comfortable doing both the task in terms of doing the domestic work as well as kind of doing the professional anthropological research. She herself kind of never tries to call herself as a feminist, and she spoke of women's rights. She was a translator of feminist poetry, but she never identified herself as a feminist. And this could be on two grounds. One, that she did not critique family. Family as an institution has been critiqued by feminist anthropology. And see, I kind of considered the joint family as an essential institution in society. So when we go back to the lecture on family, we see that joint family could be a kind of gendered imbalanced and lead to a lot of patriarchal way of thinking. The second reason why she cannot be labeled as a feminist is that she did not question the oppression of patriarchy. She enjoyed doing work like knitting, cooking, gardening, and even kind of took her children to the fields. So the advice is kind of not necessarily labeling it as a kind of a particular ideology. What is important to keep is the kind of work that she has done and the way in which she institutionalized anthropology and sociology in India. So if you look into her contribution, the study of India or the way in which sociology of India developed under her nurture is to understand that there was kind of a lot of emphasis on understanding the diversity and kind of yet understanding how despite diversity there was a sense of continuity in the society. So the valuable cultural trait are described as tolerance and awareness of diversity. So the diversity is reflected amongst the highly Brahminical culture that provides direction and unity. So when we look into her overall contribution, we know that she used an anthrometric measure to understand varieties of race. She used comparative anthropology. She did a lot of field work from the 90s, 50s and 60s, and it's kind of, but was a time when ethnography and participant observation was not known. Also, she did not do her field in one particular site. She did a multi-sited ethnography, which at those days people were not involved at. But as a woman, she faced a lot of challenge. Those days, women going out and doing research, people didn't take her seriously. They were kind of considering her as a joker or a clown, and she was against the conventional method of doing field work. She could engage people in dialogue and discussions and do her field work. So if we kind of look into the contribution, it is exhaustive, and if it, for reference, we need to kind of read Nandini Sundar's work on Irawati Karve in the book Anthropology of the East. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.